I do want to start with some reflections on your time in office and the thrust of your foreign policy focused so much on the region. But that's only a part of this conversation, and I think really the major part of the conversation will focus mostly on the here and now, because as we all know, with each year that passes, it just gets that much more dynamic and in a way urgent. So I do want to, well, I'm going to start with the Keating government's policy on China. I do want to start by giving the audience just a quick taste of what's to come on the contemporary stuff with this question. You met Chinese President Xi Jinping late last year, and you came away with this view. I'm not sure that you ever said it publicly, but certainly I know that you've expressed it. Never in all my years of going to China have I detected so seminal a shift in strategy and momentum. Now, given the last 40 years of dynamic shift, that's a big statement.
Yes, I think, look, contextually, I think you would see the 20th century economic and political order began when the United States overhauled Britain as the preeminent economic power in the middle 1880s and continued through the 20th century. While China has not, in exchange rate terms, overhauled the United States, in purchasing parity terms, it's an economy that's virtually as large as the United States. So we are seeing, you can say, from the sort of beginning of this century, a change in the international order, in the economic underpinnings of the international order, in the same way as we saw the United States take the helm in the 20th century. So I think that's on. I think then the crisis, the financial crisis in 2008-9, or 7-8 more particularly, but in the resolution in 8-9, demystified for the Chinese the sort of mysticism the Americans had about being able to manage the international economic system. And I think when that became obvious, that the mystique disappeared, that there was really chaos on Wall Street, and that the Chinese were invited into the G20 to help fund the recovery, I think the idea dropped in their mind, look, now is the time for us to press our case as a rising economic and strategic power. And I think that is, I mean, what China wants to see is a new international economic and political order, which is not part of the order produced by the victors of World War II.
And that is the momentum that you're talking about.
That's it.
That is the seismic shift.
That's the shift. So okay. I think that shift is happening and has happened.
Right.
That's what I think.
So that's the taste of what's to come. Now let's grapple with a little bit of history. You gave a speech just 3 months after you left office in 1996, which offered a summation of your foreign policy as Prime Minister, which you saw as the story of Australia's major reorientation towards Asia and the Pacific. You acknowledged Australia already had a long history of engagement with Asia, but you argued that this was the first time where all of Australia's interests, economic, political, security and cultural, converged. You believed no country was more important to Australia than Indonesia, and that the integration of China was central to the peace and growth of the region. Now, these were all your words in 96. Yeah. That containment of China was counterproductive, engagement was the only way to go. So what were the key manifestations, if you like, for you in putting that broad foreign policy objective into effect?
Well, the Soviet Union was dissolved a week before I became Prime Minister. Gorbachev signed the document that brought the Union down. And so you knew that the bipolarity of the Cold War years had ended. You know, the wall had come down earlier in 89, and then the Soviet Union was dissolved. So I saw there was a chance for open regionalism of a kind that we'd never had in the world really since the Second World War. In Europe probably, also in the Asia Pacific. And I thought that we could see the opportunity more clearly than the United States could see the opportunity. And so, as you may know, as you know, Kerry, I met, as it turned out, arrangements were in place, I met President George Herbert Bush 10 days after I became Prime Minister, and I put to him these proposals to set up what's now the APEC Leaders Meeting, which has been meeting since 1992, to bring together the leadership, to create for the first time a piece of pan-Pacific political architecture.
At leadership level?
At leadership level. Well, there wasn't any really even at sub-level except for the APEC meeting which Bob Hawke had begun 2 years earlier, which was a ministerial meeting, right? But more particularly, there hadn't been... The US has fundamentally been an Atlantic power, and the East Coast establishment has an Atlantic focus. The policy in the Pacific was basically run by the Navy. So I was trying to get the Americans at presidential level to try and engage with Asia at leadership level. But we had no structure. See, before I turned up, the Australian Prime Minister only ever went to 2 meetings. The British Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which is the great world non-meeting, and of course the South Pacific Forum. That was it. That was it. That's all these people ever went to. And so I thought, well,
a lot of bilateral, and of course, you know, underpinning Australia's foreign policy, certainly in its security sense, was ANZUS, wasn't it?
Oh, ANZUS, yes. I mean, no, I'm talking. Was ANZUS in security sense, but I'm talking about in terms of engagement. We were still caught up in the British Commonwealth thing, etc., and we were big dogs at a small pool in the South Pacific, you know. So I saw the chance of actually creating this piece of political architecture, but to do it, I had to bring in the Indonesians. Suharto had been really one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. The Japanese, of course, always negotiated from under the table. They were never on top of the table. You know, they were completely subordinate to the United States. They've been a strategic client of the United States for 60 years. The Chinese, of course, were effectively not conducting a foreign policy. Though modestly they were starting to feel their way. So I had to try and pull them together to sort of create this thing. And as it turned out, that happened. You know, that happened. So
one of the interesting aspects of this for me was the way you went about it, and it was very much Paul Keating driven. I mean, there might have been a lot of not just input but even initiative from within your foreign policy advisory team, but this was, in personality terms, this was very Keating driven in terms of the personal relationship you sought to establish with Suharto, the pitch you put to Suharto about being a pivotal player in a whole new ball game. You built on a relationship of sorts that you had with Miyazawa of Japan. He'd become Prime Minister, but he was Finance Minister when you were Treasurer. Yeah. But Li Peng was, George Herbert Bush was almost starting from scratch, and Li Peng too.
And Li Peng too, yeah. I had to get the Japanese, Miyazawa, who was a great fellow, I had to get Suharto. Without Suharto, the Japanese would never have come in. And without the Japanese in there, the Americans wouldn't have come in. And the requirement then was to try and bring the Chinese in. And the great problem with that was that the body that Bob had set up 2 years earlier, Bob Hawke, was a sort of mini OECD organisation. You know, you show me your statistics and I'll show you mine, which had the economies of Taiwan and Hong Kong in it. And of course, there was no way we were going to have a heads of government meeting where the Chinese would recognise the head of the government of Taiwan or the head of the government of Hong Kong as being of such status as to be present with the president of China. So so I had to find a way around that to get them into it. As it turned out, we did. But the real point was, and this is your underlying point in the question, Kerry, Australia does not have vital interests in Africa. It has vital interests in this region, you know. And while Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke and others had spent years on great issues, really, like apartheid and other things, Australia's vital interests coalesced here. But we had no coalescent policy. That's not to say important things had not been done. Gough Whitlam, of course, in his first visit to China, Bob Hawke himself and his encouragement of the Chinese relationship, but there was no, essentially Indonesia had been ignored, there was no framework, and there wasn't a recognition that our interests, our vital interests, were here and coalesced here. So I wanted to, by that stage, by 1992, I'd already structurally reformed the Australian economy in the financial, product and labour markets, and I was trying to sort of, you know, as I think I said to you on the program, shift the raft, turn Australia towards its future, to find our security in Asia, not from Asia. You know.
So looking, I mean, Bush initially basically left it to you.
Yeah.
He was essentially asking you to prove that you could bring these people together and actually get a serious effort rolling for a regional leaders forum. And perhaps he didn't believe you could. But before long you were dealing with Bill Clinton anyway, and you had to start all over again with him. But since the key focus tonight is China, apart from the issue, the awkward issue of Taiwan and Hong Kong, I imagine that the Chinese would have still been extremely cautious about walking down this road.
Oh, they were, and I had a bit of help inside the place from Zhu Rongji, who was a sort of one great friend I developed in China when he was vice premier and I'd been treasurer here. He was vice premier when Li Peng was premier, so he helped. And I think behind the scenes, Jiang Zemin, who was the president, helped as well, because he was one who was going to be representing China in this body. So it took a bit of doing, getting the Chinese into this. And one of the compromises we made, it was supposed to be called the APEC Heads of Government meeting, and they wouldn't accept Hong Kong and Taiwan, so we changed it to the APEC Leaders meeting. You could be a leader of an economy, but not a head of government, you know. So they turned up, but it was at the first meeting, which President Clinton hosted at Blake Island off Seattle in 1992. There was, great reserve on the part of the Chinese president and the American president. Yeah.
But that developed, didn't it?
It did develop,
I think one manifestation of that you've talked about was that when the official photos were being taken, the sort of hand was going this way, but the faces were looking resolutely out the front.
Right,
eyes weren't meeting.
That's right.
But by Bogor in Indonesia?
Yeah, a year later I had Clinton playing the trombone, I think it was, not trombone, no.
Saxophone.
Saxophone, sorry. And Jiang Zemin doing karaoke, you know, so it was a bit of a change in the tempo. And of course that's what these meetings are all about, because once you get to know somebody reasonably well, when a lot of this sort of signals intelligence turns up about what they're supposed to have said and what's going on, you get another basis for judging this material, you know, and judging them. So I think it did make a big difference.
One of the not so much sticking points, but one of the hurdles in this whole process too was the nature of the relationship between China and Japan, and I think Miyazawa gave you some insights to that.
Yeah.
Didn't he pose a question? Didn't he express his fears to you?
Yeah.
In at least one conversation.
Yeah, he hosted me one night to a dinner in a traditional Japanese dinner in Tokyo about 4 years earlier, 4 years before I became Prime Minister, maybe 4 years. And he said, Mr. Keating, tell us about the Chinese leadership. You know, what do you describe them to us, what you think of them, because they never knew them, you see. And so I went through the group, and then he said, "Do you think they'll attack us?" And I said, "Well, no, Mr. Mazar, I don't." He said, "But why not? But why not?"
And that was a sincere fear, sincerely expressed, not just a bit of theatre?
Yeah, no, that was the sort of Liberal Democratic Party, which he was a sort of prince, the governing party of Japan in the post-war years, saying this big state rising beside us is a malign state, and we expect it at some point to attack us, at some point. So they were the fears. So it was with that in my mind that this whole APEC leaders thing came along, you see, because we had to find some accommodation for Japan in this structure and to interface them with the Chinese, to get the interface with the Chinese.
Now, it was also a serious hope of yours that this would develop into a strategic forum, not just an economic forum, but a strategic forum.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, informally in some ways it may have done, but formally definitely not.
No, formally definitely not. The reason why is because, the fact is, whenever the American president meets the Chinese president, it's of its essence a strategic meeting. It cannot be anything else, But the agenda was nominally trade, but the great value of the APEC meeting was that they had these what they call bilateral meetings on the days before the plenary session and the days after. So the US and China would meet and discuss all of their issues on the meeting on the day before between themselves. So what Bill Clinton said to me was he had just defeated George Herbert Bush, and one of the issues was the war in Iraq in 1991, and Clinton attacked Bush for the commitment to Iraq, and he said to me, "I can't be focusing on domestic issues and attacking Bush for international adventurism, and 5 minutes later with you set up a big strategic body." So he said, "If you're prepared to make it look like a trade body, then I'm prepared to be in it." And so we held the first meeting in Seattle, which was the home of Boeing and Microsoft, and he wanted to give the impression it was sort of jobs across the Pacific, but in fact it was a strategic body where strategic discussions could be held bilaterally. So of course, faced with that, getting the construct, and as well as that, the value of getting the trade sinews opened up in the region, and at the same time being able to hold bilateral meetings around all sorts of issues, including strategic ones, well, I took that as a proposal.
So let's come to today, and I want to talk about the China that you know and see today, and you do have a particular set of insights available to you through your involvement as the chair of the International Advisory Council of the China Development Bank. But I want to just, as quickly as we can, get your sense of the change that you have seen since you left office, with those things, APEC and others, set up behind you when you left office 20 years ago and today. If we started with the economy, because you said in the 96 speech, quote, "This is where the wealth of the region is being created, and at a rate and volume never before seen in the history of the world." Well, if that was true of the region then, it's true of the region now multi-times over, but you could say that now of China alone today.
You could.
It's been a massive explosion, hasn't it?
Yeah, massive. It's a massive change. I mean, it's without precedence in human history. The change, the economic shift in China. I mean, China had been through their first and second industrial revolutions in 25 years, the ones that took us 2 centuries to go through, and they're now into the third industrial revolution. That is the digital revolution. So it's a gigantic achievement, and it's gone from just an agrarian economy to now about 11 trillion of GDP. The US is 17 trillion, China's 11 trillion. China's growing at 6.5% roughly. So you just do the mathematics, 6.5% on 11 is about 700 billion of new wealth. The US is 17 trillion, growing at 2, which is 50 billion of new wealth. So China is doubling the amount of new wealth in the world relative to the United States right now.
So you've been chair of that advisory council for the China Development Bank, I think, for 9 years now?
9 years, yeah.
What exactly does the bank do? How big is it? And has that role given you special access or insight into the inner workings and inner thinking of China?
Yeah, well, China Development Bank, the balance sheet's 3 times the World Bank, and its balance sheet's 2.2 trillion US dollars, 2.2 thousand billion US dollars, and its default rate's less than 1%. So it's a fantastic institution, and it was built on the German post-war development bank model, it essentially provides development finance and funding for ports, roads, railways, airports, telecommunications, dams, you name it. So all those fast trains, those cities you see, Shenzhen, all the big new cities of China were at the core funded by China Development Bank.
So your primary role and that of the council is to provide your expert views of the rest of the world economy to China.
Yeah, fundamentally to set the context annually for to see in which way the Chinese economy is going to operate, in how the environment is changing and may change, and also to talk about the priorities within China Development Bank itself.
So the other side of the coin, of course, is your interface with the Chinese. What access do you get? What insights do you get? What briefings do you? What is the quality of the briefings you get from within China about their perspective, about their plans, about their goals?
Well, I meet apart from the executive group of China Development Bank, which of course is virtually in every major development in the country. I meet the head of the National Development Commission, which effectively runs the whole development process, the governor of the central bank, the vice premier who runs the economy, mostly the premier, and occasionally the president. So you get a look from the inside out, Yeah.
So you've seen the thinking at the top as it's changed over those years, which must have been a fascinating process through the global financial crisis and China's response to that crisis. You touched on it for just a moment, but just try and give me some insights to how the Chinese handled, how they viewed the crisis, how they responded to it, that presumably, I think as you suggested, they saw it as an opportunity as much as what we, China, have to do to protect ourselves from this.
Well, they picked the calamity that was in prospect, and they were invited into the G20. The G20 was actually set up by George W. Bush. The first meeting was set up at the end of the George W. Bush presidency, and it was set up basically to bring the creditor countries, China, the big savings countries, China, Japan, Germany, in with the debtor countries in what was fundamentally a sort of a debtors meeting, And the Chinese, of course, it was agreed at the G20 that all of these states would adopt stimulatory policies, and the Chinese adopted the most ambitious stimulatory policy. And it not only saved China, that is the stimulus, the capital spending and the credit, not only saved China, it's provided 50% of world growth since 2009. 50% of world growth since 2009. And of course now they've got, in the after party, they've got hangover problems, and the Chinese are now dealing with these hangover problems. But the effect was, to give the country this big burst of growth, lift the world economy, so now they're working their way through it, and China Development Bank is part of the workout. There's there's just things like removing, dismantling oversupply, removing massive inventories, deleveraging particular businesses, putting to death zombie companies, transferring other companies abroad. So the Chinese are now, quite mechanically working their way through the overhang of the crisis. Now, of course, here, the Rudd government did the same thing with the stimulus here. The problem for the Rudd government was it never got the credit for it, particularly with the coalition being as negative as they were about the waste of capital spending and the rest. The fact is the stimulus removed any possibility of Australia having a recession. The Chinese did the same, but they did it writ large on a much bigger scale. Mm. And the end result was, it gave this big kick to Chinese growth. But more than that, it demonstrated that the Chinese, that the days of their belief in the US running the international financial system were coming to an end. And so I think it was the whole financial crisis with Lehman Brothers and Wall Street in 2007-8, which finally tipped the Chinese into moving away from their policy of caution and understatement and reservation to actually a policy of clarity, assertion and ambition. Mm. And I think you can, the Chinese, look, China was the biggest economic state in the world before the Industrial Revolution, and it will be the biggest economic state in the world in the 21st century. Mm. So China's returning to where it was before the Industrial Revolution, and they want to return in the context of an international and political system which is not what they call an exclusive system, and they regard the US system as the exclusive system. They see a much more UN-mandated system, but they do realise that we're now in a multipolar world, and the days when it was a middle kingdom with all this people and all this wealth, while Europe was emerging from the Middle Ages, is over. And we now have these big pockets of power in the United States and North America, in Europe, in Africa, in South America. So essentially China is trying to establish what they would see as the democratisation of the international system, the democratisation of it. In other words, the non-management of it by one state. Mm.
Now, I think this was around the time of your advisory council, your annual advisory council meeting last year, that you had time with Xi Jinping, yeah. And he touched on a number of these issues. He did. Yeah. The strategic issues and China's plans, yeah. China's intent, if you like. Mm. He talked, I think, in particular about two things. One, he talked about the middle income trap, and we'll come to that shortly when we come back onto economics, but he also talked about the Thucydides trap. Yeah. And this is really, I suppose, the original manifestation of this was when Athens was the rising power, yeah. And Sparta was the dominant power. Yeah. The implication, obviously, being that this is the United States and China. Yeah. How clear was he? Well, who doesn't want to avoid a trap like that? Yeah. But what did you take from how he touched on that subject?
Well, he's saying, how does the rising state meet the established state? Because, in the last dozen times this has happened, there's been a big conflict. And of course, we had 2 world wars in settling the status of Germany. Two world wars. And we can't afford a world war with the huge military power of, say, the United States or China. And see, the thing is, in the First World War, the leadership of the First World War didn't understand the power of the weapons that they had and which were unleashed in 1914. But leaders today do understand the power of the weapons. And therefore, it's unthinkable that any leadership paradigm would think in terms of the full force of both conventional and nuclear weapons today. So therefore, it's not just a matter of a sort of polite debate about how does the rising state meet the established state. The fact is, you know, you've got this huge colossus rising in the east. The United States, under the Nixon-Mao deal of 1972, had established itself in a position of primacy both with Japan and with China, with acceptance by China. Fundamentally, the underpinnings of the Nixon-Mao deal fell away the moment the Soviet Union was dissolved, because Mao did the deal with Nixon because of the Soviet infantry on Chinese borders at the time and the threat from the Soviet Union, which was an ideological state looking for world dominance. And so therefore, Mao signed up with Nixon to both recognise the United States as having strategic primacy in Asia, and China accepting that, and also seeing China being open, being made, China being allowed to be part of the US trading system and investment and technology system.
And I think what you've said is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, China went from being a card that was played by others at the big strategic table to a major player itself in the game.
Well, what happened, the underpinnings of the deal fell apart when the Soviet Union fell, but China was too weak to push the United States away. It had so accepted all through the 1990s, it accepted US primacy and has accepted it until, I'd say, 2008-9. The switch comes about 2008-9, and basically, you know, the United States is still fundamentally pursuing a policy for the maintenance of primacy against the obvious rise of China, and therefore resisting the whole idea of sharing strategic power in Asia, which I believe the United States should do with the Chinese also. We're at this sort of this kind of turning point, and in their sort of, I mean, China is a continental power, and the United States is fundamentally a naval power, and China, which has the Pacific to the east, it has Mongolia to the north, it has the Himalayas to the south, the Stan countries to the east. Has the ocean, has the Pacific to the west. It's landlocked. Its only way out is through the old Silk Road. It's fundamentally a continental basin, and it doesn't seek to become a predominant strategic world power. So therefore, it has sort of asymmetric advantages over the United States. The United States wants to be the primary world strategic power with control of North America, the Atlantic, the Middle East, and Asia, where the Chinese are in the advantageous position of seeking only to be interested in the corner of one ocean, which is the Pacific Ocean, and they sit there in the continent. That's why they're worried about their coast and they're worried about their environs, because this is how they see their world. So it's a very different, you know, they're coming at the world in a very different way, the United States.
And you're convinced that they have no ambitions beyond what you've described? They have no ambitions for at least an equal, if not the dominant, geopolitical status in a future world? No,
I think China will again be the largest state. I mean, if strategic power comes from economic power, China will again be the largest state in the world. I mean, the Industrial Revolution broke the nexus between population and GDP. Before 1800, the work all of us did in the world was of the same value. We fed ourselves, clothed ourselves, and housed ourselves. So productivity, which was muscle power, was equal across the globe. So therefore, the countries with the greatest population have the greatest GDP. China had the greatest GDP before 1800. All of a sudden, a little country like Britain starts using, congealed energy, fossil fuels in steam, and the Industrial Revolution begins, and all of a sudden a relatively little state like Britain has a bigger GDP than China. So the link between population and GDP was broken by the Industrial Revolution. Now, with globalisation, the ubiquity of the technology in the capital is rejoining the link between population and GDP. So again, the countries with the biggest populations will again have the biggest GDP. And the chances are that China will have 1 to 2 times the aggregate GDP of the United States. So if we live in a world where one state has 1 or 2 times the aggregate GDP of the other great international power, can the world be as it was? Well, the answer is no. So this is why the Chinese want a new international and political order, which they think is about democratising power. And that means, great states in Africa, great states in South America, about the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, which they belong to. They see this kind of much wider structure of the world being their bailiwick than simply being a strategic stakeholder in the way the former US Assistant Secretary of State Bob Zoellick said, we welcome China as a stakeholder. That means we welcome China as a stakeholder in our system. The Chinese are saying, really? Really?
But there's an irony when you talk about their concern to see a more democratic process globally.
Yeah.
When you look at the process, which is fundamentally still authoritarian inside their own country.
Don't get too hung up in the word democrat and democracy. I mean a more representative structure, a more representative structure of world power. I think that's what they see. So, but unlike the Soviet Union, China is not an ideological state. It was not challenging the United States globally and will not challenge the United States globally. But
did Xi Jinping make that clear in the conversation that you had with him and in his address?
He said that Bonaparte. I remember him saying, he said Bonaparte said China is a lion asleep. He said yes, the lion is awake, but it's a civilised lion. It's a friendly lion, right? Maybe
did he say how the friendly lion would react if it got a poke?
Yeah. The Chinese are all about pushing American naval power away from its coast, and of course the Americans are still operate surveillance along the Chinese coast, and of course if the Chinese Blue Water Navy sailed down the coast of San Diego, I mean, the Americans would be horrified. And you saw what happened with Jack Kennedy and Cuba. When the Soviet Union tried to put missiles on Cuba, Kennedy and the Americans made clear that the Caribbean was the area of their exclusive domain. And this is underpinning, in a messy kind of way, what's happening in the South China Sea.
It is messy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's messy.
And there is a certain amount of muscling up.
But it's basically China testing the strategic limits, and it's doing it in a very cheap way. It's got no territory. There's no territory here involved, except some rocks in the South China Sea, which they built some sand islands on. So for a very cheap price, they're putting strategic pressure on the United States. So
and are you sympathetic to the United States' position in this?
I'm sympathetic to the idea that just go back a little bit in history. What brought all this on was the Japanese, foolishly, the Japanese government acquired 2 of these islands from a private owner. And once the Japanese made the statement of saying that these islands are ours and they're nationally ours, they brought the whole thing to a head, and the Chinese nationalism, I think, and and in their broader claims decided to make the islands an issue. But the islands are really the manifestation of the problem, not the problem. The problem is the fact that power in the Pacific is not resolved. The US, President Obama's pivot, that policy was about essentially maintaining US strategic primacy, notwithstanding the rise of China. Now China's saying, look, this is not on, this is not good. The US is not going to sit down at a cabinet level or at a congressional level or any other level and say, right, we recognise that China is a great state, it's now got a GDP approaching our own, and we are going to recut the power. They're never going to do that. There's never going to be a formal agreement, a formal recutting of the power. So we're going to have these informal understandings about where the limits of the power may lie. And one of the issues in that, of course, is the South China Sea.
So when you say there are going to be these formal understandings, you just think that's the way it has to be? Or do you think that that is an understanding within the American power structures?
I don't think the United States is capable of discerning and divining a new power towards China. I don't think what Henry Kissinger did and Nixon did is capable of being done today.
So where does that take us?
The US is fundamentally unled. The US in Asia is unled.
So you don't mark Obama very highly on that front?
Well, I mark Obama for a return to liberal internationalism in international policy, and I mark Obama well for keeping the United States out of conflict in many places where he would otherwise be urged to undertake military activities. But essentially, the United States didn't see China coming and only saw it arrive at the G20 in 2009 and does not have the statecraft, does not have the psychological framework or intellectual power to divine in its current way, in the current system, to divine a new relationship with China.
Is it as bald as this, that having been the dominant power globally for so long, particularly post the collapse of the Soviet Union, but for so long, really, that they are not prepared to envisage a world where they have to share that power?
The United States has never run it in its economic and strategic history. The United States has never met a power with an economy and a society as large as this. And it's an affront to everything that is represented by American exceptionalism and the American mission of the propagation of US social and political values. The US sees itself as having a mission to propagate Jeffersonian values, and it believes it is the exceptional state in the world.
But there have been times in history where the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, including Australia, has been very thankful of that.
Yeah, that's true. But events in history change. Before that, it was Britain, and then in the 17th and 18th century, and into the 19th century, then that switch from Britain turned to the United States in the last quarter of the 19th century, and we had an American century through the 20th century. We've got another switch on our hands, another big turn on our hands with this other great state. And the Chinese know who they are and what they are. There's nothing skittish about China. They know who they are and what they are. They've had a society that's been operating for a couple of thousand years, and they think they've had a raw deal in the Industrial Revolution. They missed the Industrial Revolution. They've had 200 years of occupancy and adventurism by European powers, including Japan. So they're now saying, okay, that's over. We're now back in the game. I think the Chinese are smart enough to know there can never be one power in the world ever again. They want a multipolar structure, but they're not going to be in any way a subordinate power of the United States.
Can you see a world in the not too distant future where China and Japan actually have a healthy relationship, where Japan has been able to cast aside its fears of China, where China has been able to cast aside its memories of the Japanese, particularly World War II?
That's a possibility, and I think that the demographics of Japan, the ageing of Japan, is going to produce a political outcome at some point where an accommodation with China will become a more obvious pursuit of the Japanese.
Do you have a sense of where Xi Jinping is on this?
Well, I think that he had his Prime Minister meet the Prime Ministers of Japan, of Taiwan and South Korea last year. So I think the Chinese want to, if you like, tidy up the East. Their real future is in the West. They want to rebuild the old Silk Road, railways and highways, up through the Stan countries, up to Istanbul and up to the Baltic coast of Poland. So what I think we're going to see is a reasonably obvious economic, I'd use this in inverted commas, but economic colonisation of the 50-odd states between the western border of China up to at least Eastern Europe.
When you say the colonisation, you mean?
The delivery of economic goods, and the integration of these countries with the economy of China.
And of course you're seeing a new relationship developing now, of course, between the Russians and China.
Yeah, that's a sort of a natural corollary of this change. So in other words, you see, in a way the United States has always been, not only did the Pilgrims find this wonderful arable country, vast as the United States is, has been protected by two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and with two friendly states to the north and the south with Canada and Mexico. But in many ways, compared to where China is, it's a kind of, the oceans are now a corset for the United States, whereas China's got this opportunity through Central Asia and Eurasia, which I think they will rather ruthlessly exploit.
So when you're talking about China policy under Obama, of course Hillary Clinton was very much at the heart of that for his first term.
Yeah.
And we're all, I was going to say almost certainly, I'll take the almost out because I don't want to believe the opposite, a Clinton presidency.
Yeah.
More of the same?
It would be the denial of reality to keep it all the same. And I think Hillary Clinton's too smart for that, frankly. You know, so, I mean, Hillary Clinton will do what... Look, this is my view about the United States. I said this to Clinton in 1997. I said, the United States should consolidate the Atlantic. I said, you let China in the WTO, China will be a state as large as you. I mean, Bill at the time didn't believe that, by the way. I said, the US should consolidate the Atlantic. It's got 17 trillion of GDP in North America, and in Canada it's about 20-odd trillion. They've got the Atlantic itself, they've got NATO, they've got 20 trillion of GDP in Western Europe. And the great challenge for the United States in Europe is to integrate Russia into Europe and to deal with Turkey. But you could consolidate the Atlantic. I said, in the Atlantic, the United States should be the framer and the guarantor of security in this region. Whereas in Asia, if it persists continually to try and be the framer and the guarantor, it'll run up against China and China's legitimate interests. So I think that, you know, I told Clinton at the time, I think that the United States should be the balancer and the conciliator in Asia, rather than to be the framer and the guarantor. Now, if Hillary Clinton believes that the United States still has the maritime capacity and strategic capacity to be the framer and the guarantor in Asia, despite despite the legitimate ambitions and economic scale of China, then I think that would be a great mistake, and it's a mistake I don't think she will ever make.
You've talked recently about a fundamental difference of culture, really, in the way the Americans negotiate compared to how the Chinese negotiate. I think with the Americans, you said, or not just the Americans, but the West broadly, that the West anticipates resolution following negotiations. For the Chinese, it's one long negotiation.
Yeah, the Chinese, in the Western mind, there is always this idea that you have an objective, you have a beginning, a middle and an end, and you go through these reasonable process of consultation, discussion, and you arrive at a set of conclusions. This is not how the Chinese think at all. For China, particularly moving out of the cocoon of their misfortune through the 19th and 20th centuries, now into the opportunity of the 21st century, not only is it difficult for them to define a policy for themselves in this region, but there's something in the Chinese psychology which is not about defining it anyway. So, the United States is always looking for conclusions from the Chinese, which the Chinese will never provide them. Right? Never provide them.
Yeah. So I think one senior Chinese official, I'm not sure whether this was your most recent visit over there or the one before, she talked about the fact that China and America were each kind of talking past the other.
Yeah. Each say they believe in the current international system, but the Chinese regard the current international system as essentially a US-based system which is exclusive, in which China is not part of the security arrangements and the strategic arrangements. Whereas when the Chinese talk about the international system, they're talking about the UN system. And remember, they're sitting in the UN and they have a veto power, right? So they're one of the five. Is it five? I think the five permanent members of the Security Council. So they see this sort of a system, notwithstanding its deficiencies, as being more representative than the exclusive system the US is running. So that's why they say they're talking past each other. They say, look, we believe in globalisation, believe in international trade, we believe in the fungibility of money worldwide, we believe in the international economy, we believe in the international system, but we're sort of talking past each other. So essentially, and you can see also Chinese interest in Africa, in these great states in Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, these sort of countries, which are going to come up in the world in the 21st century, and they are not part of the governing system. They're not. So the Chinese will just press on with this demand of theirs or this policy of theirs to, they say, democratise the international system. They mean make it more representative. And the Americans will try and hang on to the power as long as possible. That's what's going to happen.
So now let's come to Australia and all this. We've talked about what you sought to do 20 years ago. You've obviously been a very keen and interested observer of various governments since. But what do you think Australia should be doing now compared to what it is doing in the context of all that we've been talking about? Let's talk about the geopolitical first. The United States, China. We kind of easily talk about special relationships. We've certainly got a special treaty with America, which gives us a certain kind of entree, gives us a certain kind of voice. China, on the other hand, is this massive trading partner of ours with whom, on whom we have enormous dependence. But it's pretty clear observation that when it really comes to the crunch, we go that way. We don't sort of go a little bit each way.
Yeah.
If we had to take a position between America and China, we would almost certainly, in every big instance, go with America, wouldn't we?
Well, the fact is Australia needs a foreign policy and it needs it urgently. And Australia does not have a foreign policy. That's the biggest problem. I mean, I've been perhaps, a lot of these humanitarian things we do, whether we're, you know, recovering people from the Ukraine after that disaster or these things, these are worthy things for an Australian nation and foreign policy, but they are not a foreign policy. You know, we both need and deserve a nuanced foreign policy, which does take account of these big seismic shifts in the world, and we can't ever be caught up in some containment policy of China or seemingly containment policy of China to assist the Americans to try and preserve strategic hegemony in Asia and the Pacific. Strategic hegemony by the United States in the Pacific is incapable of preservation, and therefore we should be urging American friends, and they are our friends, to recognise that the US has got to move from a framing and guaranteeing role to a balancing and conciliating role, and a legitimate role. And I think it's very important in that the Chinese recognise the importance of the United States and the importance of continued US engagement in the region. So this sort of policy, I think, would matter a great deal to us. The other thing is that I think that the days when we had influence as China was rising, for instance, look at us as a gift of Australian foreign policy, putting together the APEC leaders meeting in my case, or Kevin Rudd's involvement with the East Asia Summit. Those days are, I think, now very limited. I don't think the Chinese or the Americans need us to negotiate with them or between them, and therefore I think we're becoming a much more marginal power than we even were 20 years ago. Much more marginal power. And this is why I believe we should be...
Our influence is waning.
I think our aptitude in foreign policy smarts may not be waning, but our influence is waning. And therefore, I think we should be more interested in the world around us. And this is why I've always believed Indonesia, there's no country any more important than Indonesia to us, because where Indonesia goes strategically, so go we. And ASEAN, which was once a body managed by great minds like Lee Kuan Yew, President Suharto.
Can you get the name Mahathir out?
Well, Mahathir at least knew what he wanted. I've never thought much of his administration, but at least he had a vision of what he wanted. I think ASEAN's drifted, and I think our membership of ASEAN would make a great difference to ASEAN, and it gives us a home, but more particularly a home that the Chinese and the Japanese regard as very important. They regard Southeast Asia as a particularly important place between that other great state that's a potential rival of theirs, India, right? So it's a sort of... the fulcrum area is Southeast Asia. You've got India on the one side, China on the other, both in their particular oceans. And the United States, of course, has relationships and friendships with many of the countries of Southeast Asia. So therefore, it's in our interest to see ASEAN succeed, and I think we should become a member of it. In other words, recognise where we are influential, where we can add value, and at the same time where we sort of insulate our own opportunities, preserve our own opportunities.
If we're going to be serious about that, and let's say we started walking down that line, does there come a day when ANZUS, in the way it's been understood and practiced in the past, becomes anachronistic, outlives its value? I mean, I know that strategically Australia regards it as terribly important, the access it gets to intelligence because of the ANZUS treaty. But in the world that you're describing, can we continue not just to exist in this region, but be seen as a genuine player and a genuine participant in this region, but our dominant and predominant relationship is with the United States?
Yeah, well, look, the the alliance with the United States has underpinned Australian security in all of the post-war years. But this primarily relies upon the United States being the preeminent superpower and the strategic power in the Asia Pacific, the sole strategic power in the Asia Pacific. That has changed. What I think Australia should be doing is using diplomacy, that is the elasticity of diplomacy and foreign policy, as our first power, and therefore try and construct a progressive and ambitious policy towards the countries in the region, the most important for us, and the big ones like Indonesia, Southeast Asia, Indochina, China itself, Japan, where we take these countries' interests to heart, at the same time recognise the legitimate role and power of the United States in the area. Now, I think all this can be done consistent with the ANZUS alliance. I don't think it needs to be some exclusive arrangement outside the ANZUS alliance. But the days when we sort of reject diplomacy and foreign policy and essentially try and find our security from Asia rather than in Asia, which was basically the Howard policy, fundamentally, would be a mistake on our part.
We've seen the Trump phenomenon, and even though Trump will almost certainly go down, the disaffected people who have given him his rise will still be there, and a part of the kind of phobia and the fear that drives them is this word China. In Australia, we've seen the rise of Hanson again, the re-emergence of Hanson. Yeah. We saw, for instance, the Treasurer Scott Morrison decide to knock back the Ausgrid, the attempt, or the offer by Chinese interests to take a 50% interest in Ausgrid. He said on grounds of national interest, and in fact it's been reported that the board also received advice from intelligence agencies recommending against it on national security grounds. But this is against the background of Hansonism and that kind of that worry about xenophobia. So Scott Morrison might be making a perfectly legitimate decision there, but for some already it's seen as more responding to Hanson, who's going to be a vote they may need on crucial bills in the Senate. So you've got these elements mitigating against cool, sensible, rational decision-making on foreign policy in this country and with sort of Trumpism in America. It's true, isn't it?
Well, let's go to the Trumpism first. I mean, Trump may win.
I refuse to believe that, Paul.
And
I don't, I mean...
But whether Trump wins or not, whether the US will continue to bear the burden, as Jack Kennedy said, and try and maintain power across three oceans, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean and the Pacific, with a massive call on American savings and American economic wealth, or whether not an isolationism in America. I don't think we're going to see a 30s isolation, but let's call it some withdrawal of American power. The one place Australia does not want to be is having put all of the chips on the United States to find the United States withdrawing from the region. I don't think the United States is going to withdraw from the region. I think its role in the region has to change. But a wise country, and I'd like to think Australia is a wise country, will at least hedge its bet on the possibility of US strategic withdrawal of some measure in this part of the world, which then augurs again for the argument of running a nuanced, balanced, cooperative foreign policy, in its lieu. So that's one of the issues in Trumpism. The other about xenophobia, the problem about a double dissolution is you halve the quotas. So all the rubbish in the world comes into the Senate, you know. And so, when you 12 senators, you elect 12, 12 into 100, 12 is 8, 12 8's 96, 8 and a bit percent, and then you get a quota. So of course, all these xenophobes turn up, all sorts of people turn up. I don't think that.
But Hanson's vote is a reflection of something, isn't it? It is a reflection of, you might say, ignorance,
Yeah.
but it's fear. Fear and ignorance go together, isn't it? And
It's reactionary. It's reactionary.
It was a bigger vote than I would think we should be comfortable with.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's reactionary. Sure. Yeah, but it doesn't control the executive government, and it shouldn't.
But it's not a good climate for. We're looking at these controversial decisions being taken with regard to foreign investment.
Yeah.
And yes, there's a difference between a foreign company wanting to invest in Australia, and a company that is controlled, run or whatever by a state. They're two different things. Nonetheless, this is not a great climate for rational decisions to be taken and accepted as rational, is it?
Well, I'd be disappointed if the Treasurer made a decision with reference to the climate rather than the issues. I think the Treasurer should be capable of making a decision with reference to the issues rather than the climate.
And you think the decisions thus far on these issues, the Kidman one is another one, have been taken on the issues rather than the climate?
It's a bit hard to know. I mean, for my part, there's controversy around China State Grid. With a different hat on, I actually helped China State Grid purchase a part of the Victorian electricity holdings of Singapore Power. So I'm quite, in a sense, where these assets were not strategic. I have no problems about China State Grid being a state-owned enterprise of China. But I would take a position that I don't think any state-owned company of any country ought to hold or be able to own and control key strategic telecommunications assets in Australia. I don't. The Chinese would never allow Telstra to have key communication assets in Beijing or Shanghai, and nor should they, any more than we should let a Chinese state-owned company hold key telecommunication assets here.
I don't want to get bogged down. This is my last question on it, but strategic assets don't begin and end with telecommunications, though, do they?
No, they don't, and therefore that means the Treasurer acts upon the advice of the Foreign Investment Review Board where these questions are considered. But where you've got a bunch of assets which are not strategic or necessarily that strategic, then I don't see any problem about China State Grid or any other Chinese state-owned enterprise, owning them.
Now, we're getting close to time, but I do want to come back to economics a little bit, and I want to come to that other point that Xi Jinping made about the traps he wanted to avoid, and one of them was the middle class trap.
The middle income trap.
The middle income trap.
Yeah.
Now, what is the trap?
Well,
and how is he going to avoid it?
Yeah, well, we'll put it this way: the story of modern China is fundamentally a story of urbanisation. Half the country is moving to the cities. The cities are full of people, and the price of people normally goes up. So if the Chinese want a consumer and service society of the kind we have in this city of Sydney, then they have to have incomes rising. And it is the policy of the Chinese State Council to see strong income growth to underpin a cosmopolitan service economy. You can't have incomes rising and at the same time make cheap manufactured goods competitively. So at the moment, Chinese employment and a lot of economic activity is in the production of goods which it sells to the world, which are made at low costs by people paid on relatively low wages. So if China is to see itself moving to a middle income status in the cities and therefore as a society, the two are inconsistent. You cannot manage and have in the one country very low paid people doing manufacturers and much higher paid people. I mean, Xi Jinping was saying to me that he wants to see Chinese average incomes per capita at $12,000 US by 2020, $12,000 US. And he said by 2020 we should have a GDP of 16 to 18 trillion. He actually nominated the numbers, 16 to 18 trillion. That's fundamentally, he's saying in 2020 we'll have an economy the same size as the United States, and we'll have a moderately high income society. To get to there out of the current drivers of growth, which are state investment in roads, airports, railways, steelworks, all massively overinvested, and low-paid manufacturing jobs, to get away from these traditional drivers, to get up to the higher orders of services and manufacturing, one has to escape this trap, the middle income trap. In other words, you've got to make a choice here. You've got to either head for the higher orders of incomes and services, or you stay locked into the old East Asian drivers of capital investment and low-paid jobs in manufacturing. And that's their problem. If they get out of the manufacturing too quickly, they end up with high unemployment and social unrest. But if they don't continue to move up the value chain, they end up with just a low-grade society which will never challenge the United States in its bulk, And I believe the Chinese will escape the middle income trap, that they will make these changes. And for instance, what China Development Bank is now doing in terms of unwinding overcapacity, funding the reduction in inventories, in dealing with the over-leveraging that came out of 2008-9, both through the banking system. These sort of changes are important changes on the pathway to the higher order economy, So I think they'll get there. Maybe a bit messy, maybe a bit slower, but they'll get there.
And also, in the kind of the pragmatic approach they're taking, they're going to cut back further in terms of steel consumption. They're going to cut back very substantially on coal consumption, aren't they?
They're going to take another 100 million tonnes out of steel. In the next year or two, they're going to take another, I think, 500 million tonnes out of coal. They're cleaning up. The green technology is a big growth thing for them. They're cleaning up the environment. It's becoming, China's going to become more and more a tertiary economy. And its research and development is not going to be a research and development based on Western technology. They're going to be able to develop their own. And also just their commerce platforms, like Alibaba. Alibaba had 45% growth in revenue in the last 6 months. 45%. It's got 78% market share. It's just, Alibaba, these private internet businesses are going to massacre the state-owned enterprises. So we're going to see this big shift from state-owned enterprises to private enterprises in China by way of the connectivity of the internet and open sourcing, China...
Somewhere in all of that, of course, managing their own domestic political situation and dealing with whatever upward pressures there are for a more democratic society.
Yeah.
But these are the kinds of shifts you're talking about, the economic shifts in China have got huge ramifications for Australia, given how much we've relied on our commodities for our wealth.
Well, look at this university, Chinese students here.
Yeah.
So this is why, the Chinese have taken, 500 million people out of poverty. They've now got them right. I mean, it's a massive achievement. They've now got rising incomes. They've got modern cities. They've got modern infrastructure. They have modern highways. They have modern railways. They have modern telecommunications. And they're going to have higher incomes with people bidding for services and higher value-added goods. So, this is going to be a massive force of an economy to be dealt with, and the benefits for Australia are going to be profound. And so,
how well prepared are we to achieve those benefits, to guarantee those benefits?
I think we're reasonably well prepared. I mean, This is a very flexible economy via the exchange rate, via wages. We're competitive. We're open. Our service sector is of high technical value. Our supply chains, our management groups are good. I think we have a very great opportunity to maximise the China opportunity. But we'll need to have our eyes open for it and go and do it.
Paul Keating, it'd be nice to end on an optimistic note. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us on China tonight.
Good.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, insightful, refreshing, brilliant. The mind of Paul Keating being probed and prodded by a veteran interviewer, a great interlocutor in Kerry O'Brien. I know I speak for everyone here when I record how delighted we are for this opportunity. This was an unforgettable insight for all of us into the thinking of not a former Australian Prime Minister, but an Australian strategic thinker, someone thinking to this day, years after having served his country so well as Prime Minister and Treasurer, thinking to this day about how Australia makes its way in the world. And for giving us those insights to the two of you, much thanks. The Australia-China Relations Institute takes an unabashedly positive view, like the tone just captured in the final answer by the former Prime Minister, of what this relationship means to us. Founded with the support of Zhang Mo Wang, who's with us tonight, backed now by 20 Australian corporates, recruiting new members from both China and Australia, sustained by this splendid university, we take a positive view of where this relationship can go for Australia and for China. There'd be a different way of making a China policy. We could take the view that's expressed in columns every week in the Australian media that effectively says Australia should forget about having its own China policy, just see it through the lens of Washington. That would simplify the choices for us. We wouldn't have joined the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. We had a choice. We might have taken the choice not to have joined. We would be running patrols right now in the South China Sea that penetrated a 12 nautical mile radius around Chinese structures. We'd be the only American friend, partner or ally to do it, but it's a choice. We could do it and have our relationship with China take a serious hit. We could have dumped a competitive tender process and just chosen to buy our subs from Japan, which would have sent a message to the world that we were somehow lining up for a trilateral policy designed to contain China. We could have done all these things. But we do have the option of doing what other Western-aligned nations do, and that is craft a China policy that takes account of our interests, Australian interests, a pragmatic China policy, which is what every American friend, partner and ally, apart from Japan, which has the delicate relationship with China pointed to in this conversation, weighing on it. But the choice is there. We can opt to have a policy that takes account of Australia's interests, or we can choose that somehow in our inadequacies we can only see China through a Washington lens. And some people would have us do that. I think a lot of Australians would think in the East China Sea we should be neutral. In the South China Sea we should move with like-minded opinion, not make a flamboyant gesture of running patrols that won't resolve anything. And that we were right to join the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, not take the advice of the US President, advice I think that he's now regrets giving, that we should stay out of it. In other words, we're capable of having what we say in ACRI is a positive and optimistic view of the Australia-China relationship. And in what seemed 100 ways, it was pointed at and confirmed and picked over and analysed in the conversation we've just been privileged to hear. The notion of Australia helping to construct a conversation between a US president and a Chinese president in a forum that hadn't previously existed. Or the idea that China is doing nothing more than returning to a status it had in the world in the early part of the 19th century. But, and Paul underlined this on a few occasions, doing so in the expectation it'll be part of a multipolar world. It's not seeking hegemony. It's seeking to have influence in its environs, not seeking to have its system promoted halfway around the world, promoted in every continent of the world. The elasticity of diplomacy was one of those beautiful Keating locutions. And it's an invitation for all of us to think about what diplomacy can do, what an active foreign policy can do in resolving differences and in creating opportunities and keeping options alive for Australia, not closing them off in a burst of flag waving and table thumping. China, the former Prime Minister said, is looking to exert legitimate power, and America would be well advised to work out ways of sharing that. That is, power in the Asia-Pacific with a China that's going to have, as we keep saying, a middle class with 850 million more people in it, only 14 years from now. And there lies Australia's great opportunity, even as Paul contemplated the winding down of steel and coal, the end of that sort of relationship between Australia and China. So many opportunities in a China that's driven by consumption, the growth of the consumption sector, and driven by the colossal growth in services. I could imagine Paul saying, if given the opportunity, there'd be something wrong with Australia if we can't make our fortune out of that new China. That China surging into predominant middle-class status, 70% of its population with middle-class standing and spending power. For all of us attached to this great university, this has been a wonderful evening, as I said, one that I don't think any of us are going to forget. Kerry, you made it possible. Paul, thank you for being so very, very generous with your time, and thanks for sharing a vision. And a vision, I think, summed up by this notion that Australia can be brave and big enough and imaginative enough to devise and nurture and craft its own policy with the people of this re-emergent China. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing it with us, and thanks to our two wonderful guests.
Thanks, Dad.